Well, welcome everybody. Our final discussion, summary discussion from the conversations that we all had this morning and this afternoon. Wanted to welcome Michele and Brent from this morning. Jorg had to leave, so we have an empty chair in his honor here. You'll talk about what we talked about this morning, and then we have Joné, Stephen, and John talking about the conversations this afternoon. As you know, we really wanted to hear your thoughts about both how we can connect the IGC to curriculum, to other colleagues inside the university, as well as to larger communities. So that was the gist of the morning conversation. And then the afternoon conversation, as you know, was really about what's the future of the IGC, how might we organize this entity going forward, how could we be more effective? And so I wanted to start by just having the reporters kind of summarize the conversations that you heard, and then as we did yesterday, open it up for a larger conversation with everybody. So who wants to start, Brent or Michele? Do you want to? Go for it. There you go.
Okay, we start talking, we have an interesting discussion about the learning outcomes for the students. Was the first question, and we realize immediately that there are some that are IGC specific, while some other more Geo-Design related more broadly. And I will start from those. Basically, working with Geo-Design in general, some students were among us, and they specified that using collaborative method is very important, and this is something new that they learn. And someone mentioned the creation of a collective intelligence in this collaboration, and due to the integration of backgrounds. Some other students also highlight that working with alternatives was something new for them. And also in many cases, most of the project that done by the member of our discussion actually include engagement of citizens, and this is a little bit lead to following question, but also was something important for the students. I mean, was seen as something very attractive. And the specificity of IGC is the forward-looking long-term perspective of the study, and this was mentioned as something new. And also one thing that is related to this, not in running the project, but someone mentioned that the old IGC project from last year were used as a knowledge base to study the methods that were applied before to work this second year. This, I think, is quite important. In general, I would say that again, in most of the project there was a collaboration, especially in the US. There are a lot of collaboration with clients, so this is not probably an issue. It's something that is already happening, and using the SDG oftentimes create a good link. In some other cases, sometimes the work done with the IGC have to be, I mean, doesn't go to the client in the same format, but some part of the study, some part of the product are then delivered to the client in a little bit different way. And about the integration in the curriculum, it was quite clear from the discussion that it depends a lot from the university structure, and US probably are different from Europe. In most of the cases, the structure is quite rigid. However, some of us could find a way, either informal way to involve other colleagues, or in some cases that I could consider best practice, just to find a creative way within the rigid structure to propose something new. And this is probably best practice to follow.
Great, good. Brent?
We had a small teams of people that worked through these different ideas. There are about 4 groups of about 5 or so people, and then we talked collectively. So we've tried to summarize each of those different groups' thoughts into one piece. So to the first question, what do you observe are important leading outcomes for students? The sort of primary benefit that we got from this, and I'll read it here, it says, holistic thinking is centered on a structured process that provides additional skill sets and opportunities for student designers to learn to address wicked problems. The idea is that it was process focused, not necessarily the specific systems that we worked with, because those can vary between different kinds of projects when you get into those in practice. But this process largely engaged students across these different systems through this process that is exceedingly helpful. One of the limitations that came out of there, again, I'll just read directly, says, in the pursuit of balance and comparison between these different projects. If the process structure evokes too many constraints, it can evoke too many constraints towards student learning. If the students and faculty approach this in a dogmatic way, which is not necessarily how we're all doing it, but if it is approached in that way, the outcomes can limit the adoption within industry as well as limit how students approach future problems that they don't perceive as fitting the framework, right? So this is to the notion of if it's required versus enabling. If that rigidity is something that as this catches on and continues to go to other institutions, if they're looking at this as a dogmatic approach, it can be challenging as students transition to practice where they're trying to bring this process into those practices where they don't understand how to translate what it is they did in a class project to these projects in the real world. And I think trying to make sure that we focus on process rather than just the specific outcomes is going to be one of the more helpful pieces. But we need to do that in a way to help them translate that from this academic context to this industrial context. We further went through and looked at this, as a range of different elements, so it helps students develop questions and defend different positions because it was a structured way. Right? This is the notion to the defensible process. Right? In science, we use a process that is intended to be defensible as a knowledge-generating process. This is when we try to help students say, this is the defensible planning process. How else would you do this? Right? And if you can give us another idea, let's iterate and make it better. And I think to that notion it can be very helpful for students in that in the outcome of this. So question B, how might IGC projects be configured to engage a broader spectrum of students, both by degree level and discipline? We approach this question in small groups of saying, what have you done and what would you need in order to accomplish this? So we came away with something, whether it's the triumvirate as we're calling it now, or something else in the future, however the organizational structure looks. Need IGC to help us as faculty members, institutions, staff, otherwise, to promote and advertise collaborative opportunities. Are there strategies or structures where we can do this? Are there people that have good mechanisms that they've been able to reach across other departments? These sorts of ideas to help spur those collaborations with folks that may not be thinking in that way. So how do we do this? Is help us in strategizing where geodesign can be promoted, what sorts of issues, departments, disciplines, problems, learning how we can expose courses within interdisciplinary settings, finding a way to make courses more accessible. So one of the challenges in studio-based courses is they're often at the credits that are inaccessible to students from outside. So one example is Mintai had suggested is a variable course credit load. Something to this notion that allows, say, scientists or artists or whoever else that may be coming into these processes, computer scientists, to engage within the credit kind of structure that they have in an academic institution. I think also in that way is when we're trying to get these strategies of advertisement, are there certain ways in which we can engage best or ask questions that sort of optimize the recruitment of these different disciplines. So whatever help we can get from IGC to do that institutionally amongst faculty and otherwise, I think would be very helpful. Question C, identify specific ways in which this work can be shared with citizens and decision makers. The first bullet we had on here is establishing long-term relationships. I know sometimes it can be difficult when we're trying to get sponsored studios, that they might be a one-off or a two-off sort of thing. I think one of the benefits of longer-term relationships is that then those industry partners also get to engage with that process again and again and again, so that that can become adopted or absorbed in part of their own processes, and then get them here as part of Geo-Design or get them involved in IGC. And if they're one-off sort of pieces, I think that can be harder to allow that infusion of this way of thinking and addressing problems to become commonplace in industry. We wanted to suggest that at least at this point right now, there's a reliance on faculty networks. So faculty need help building networks. For instance, a young faculty member that engages in a new place, who are the kinds of people they could reach out to in state institutions, in county institutions, in NGOs in their regions? That sort of, is there a hierarchy or a strategy at which a young faculty member could try to reach out to possible networks to work with this? And several other pieces. For sake of time, so question D, identify ways to share within university communities with potential partner disciplines. So again, reaching out, whether that's to others or IGC, whoever's involved in this organizational structure here, documenting the process in such a way to provide sort of the equivalent of an executive summary piece to potential partners. And there are plenty of resources and videos and talks and these sort of things. How do we boil that down so we can say, hey, watch this 5-minute video of how this class or that class or that class addressed this problem that might be relevant to what you are working on. So some examples, video promotions we could pass along, these sort of hyperlapse videos of a student project going through a year kind of thing, right? That can also help with students getting an idea of this process in another form of media that's a bit more germane to the current vernacular of youth. Getting to know existing research projects on campus and highlighting those, right? So this is who's working on some really challenging research question. You're going to pursue the science of that. We'd like to actually figure out how to solve whatever that problem is. So we'll start with this now, and we'd like to interact with you as an engagement. And that may be a great way to bring those graduate students into class to provide some new fusion of scientific data or otherwise, assessment methods, impact methods, so on and so forth. Also, there was a suggestion to integrate with existing outreach organizations on campus or within campus, as well as extension projects in particular. So seek out those extension personnel that might be in your team.
Good.
Leave it at that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. A lot to talk about, but let's move to this afternoon. And Joné, why don't you go first? The questions around the future of the IGC.
Okay. Just a small question.
Small task.
Yeah. Well, in a way, we didn't necessarily address these in order. They kind of wove back and forth. And I would say we were fortunate to have a number of students in the room that we could tap also. And the conversation rather quickly centered around the kind of, I would almost say, a theory of growth. How does an idea or an organization grow? And a recognition that the uptake and the interest of students, both within their academic experience, but also afterward, is certainly one very important element of growth. That to the extent that those students feel that they can carry it forward in their practice, which kind of ties into something you were saying, and also that they're really bought in as part of this movement, is how this could more likely go viral, kind of the natural organic growth of the idea and generating broad buy-in. And we talked about the role of participation in getting that buy-in and that relationship to the vision, and having a voice in the process, and also not only, of course, they're juniors, right? There's a great body of wisdom, But in terms of uptake, maybe they are the experts in the experience design that's needed for them to bring this forward and to learn from the process. And so we made an attempt at an org chart, an experimental org chart, and I'll just get up now.
Yeah.
And we experimented with the idea, if this theory of change that the student experience is central to the growth of IGC and Geo-Design, then should we start with students at the top as a kind of experimental inverted structure, not as obviously decision makers, but as the kind of centering students, I guess, centering the student experience, and the teachers. It's kind of a both and then how, and of course these questions that get asked in the structure is intended to draw that experience in, but we felt in the room a hunger for peer-to-peer conversation that isn't fully, we all love these discussion breakout rooms, but wasn't maybe fully being met at the conference, and brainstorm some ideas like poster sessions where we could have more in-depth conversation about each other's projects, but also some kind of structure for fostering team-to-team conversation before the conference and connecting either on types of communities or types of environmental problems or SDGs addressed, different ways of possibly connecting. One tool that could help that is when a project is registered, instead of just the name and basic information, that there be an abstract to help people with similar interests find each other and communicate with each other. So in this org chart, we were looking at how could we foster peer-to-peer kind of a community of practice. Students kind of nodded when we said, would you like to talk with students in other locations? It seemed that they would. And then also internationally, as IGC thinks about these global scale, how do we position ourselves amongst the other people thinking globally? So maybe considering how it could be perceived that we're centering the US in a particular approach when there's many people working across the globe on these issues. And so how can we participate in that larger conversation with all the value that this approach has to offer? And this, one thing that came up from the student experience and the studio experience is this tension, and it's come up multiple times. I know it's an acknowledged issue of what's the same and what's flexible. And it seems in some ways that it's the tension between the native language of what a studio wants to be to meet its curricular goals and the community and the problems being addressed, and the common language that it allows us to communicate. And so I thought I heard that there was some desire to hear each other's stories in the native language too, to understand the way that people were approaching things, as well as the ability to rapidly absorb a poster because it's a common language. So those were some thoughts related to the org chart, and of course we didn't solve it. We didn't really all understand what the current org chart is, but this idea of...
There isn't one.
Oh, well, I've got one here.
Okay, good.
For my group. So the global question, everyone in the room was quite intrigued with the global question, and yet it starts to get beyond normal design practice, and thinking to the classic diagram of scale, you know, the designers at one scale, the global scientists at another scale, meeting in the middle in Geo-Design. The global scientists have their own native language too. And so one of the people in the room wondered, could people who are not practicing Geo-Design proper participate in IGC if they have the scenarios? Maybe it ultimately is design. We've kind of talked about anyone who plans for the future as being a designer, but does that open up the IGC platform more if someone who's done let's say a global food scarcity study and what policy might impact that can come into the IGC platform with a poster, maybe without necessarily referencing some of the same language, but really ultimately doing the same kind of thing. And could that foster more of the integration of the sciences into the conversation? So that was one perspective on how to integrate the global, both acknowledging the expertise of that scale, but also the native language maybe of that group. And maybe one more thing on the global, there was a great interest, as I said, in this peer-to-peer collaboration during the work, not just arriving at the conference. And we talked about the difference of global being many locals and international conversation versus global really connecting to the global science. And I would think it would be really exciting for a design studio to be talking to global scientists, even if they're not quite sure how they connect, just to begin those scalar approaches to the middle or to the common language. There was a lot more. I hope I've done it justice, but I'm going to pass it on.
Sure. Well, we'll have more time to talk. Thank you. Stephen. Or John.
So we were reporting from room 2 and started with this question, how should IGC proceed globally, ?
Right.
And trying to make that actionable in a discussion. It was, if we understood pretty clearly what Carl had in mind, including his cryptic statement that we would make something that would look like a global plan, but we would know it wasn't really, and what that might actually mean. We got about half the room, 50% more or less, on a straw poll basis, said, yeah, I'll go for that. And so wondering what the other half might be, we said, what about if we said, we don't know exactly what this means, but we think IGC should embrace globality more and better? 100% buy-in. Clear that there's a consensus about moving in that direction, but what exactly does it mean? And then what would be the logistics of this? And how would you actually structure one of these problems? More than we're going to be able to solve in 90 minutes. And in fact, this is going to take several years probably to figure out. And so therefore, what are the principal elements of work plan for the IGC to continue or to immediately, and with sincerity and some intention of succeeding, work out this question of what is an organization chart for, and what is a succession plan for the current triumvirate, and what are the mechanisms for organizing, and what are some examples of things that have worked well around the world in this way that we might model ourselves after. GitHub was brought up as one. This is the international open source grassroots, until they got bought by Microsoft, for billions of dollars because they were so successful without Microsoft, way of organizing software projects with storage mechanisms, team organization mechanisms. They're not Slack, but they're Slack supported. Slack seems to go hand in hand with GitHub. And this idea of loosely distributed, well-meaning folks with a technological arsenal of tools that enable the kinds of thing they're trying to do together. So building open source software and branching and debugging and documenting it as a very specific set of skills, and therefore a specific set of tools were built around it.
Right.
Could we learn from the UN? How is the UN structured with a kind of a largest, if we're going to go global in some way, what would that mean? And how do we achieve representation? And where are the decision-making structures? We came up with an idealized org chart, which says, this body needs a head, so there's something at the top that we'll call the IGC Steering Committee. And it notably has something called the Secretary General, who has a staff and money to pay them with to get stuff done. There's a cloudy group of non-IGC participants in a board, an advisory board, communicating directly with the Director General and the IGC Steering Committee. who are then sitting on top of a structure which may look like it has 2 levels, or it could be one large blob connected up with some arbitrary dividing lines, where there is a whole set of project managers, local coordinators, the kinds of people who have been presenting here and running projects, who are also supported, may participate in, and can certainly call upon a set of councils of expertise. We founded a little bit on what are the many kinds of expertise that could be included. One would be a set of thematic ones, people who are coastal development experts. Then there's people who are marketing and outreach experts, and there are people who are software development and team communications experts. But there would be some kinds of domain-specific expertise that would be required, documented, have a wiki, a method for changing and holding on to information and organizing it over time. And then at the bottom of this org chart are the army of, or the task rabbits who are actually doing all the work that gets done. And they range across a wide realm of kinds of skills, whether they are GIS technicians or young landscape architects or communications majors, and we talked a little bit about the need to have them be as multidisciplinary as possible, that if we have some government students and business students, along with government professors and business professors, we're much more likely to be resilient than if there's a whole bunch of landscape architects and urban designers who we're not sure have got the necessary depth and breadth to actually pull this thing off and need those. And therefore, if you're going to have a process to build this kind of an organizational structure that is open and engaging to bring in outsiders, both as participants, as TaskRabbits, and as project leaders, and as advisory board members, that takes so much effort. There's no way we could possibly engage with trying to figure out what a global data set would work or what a global impact model should be like. And so we floated a proposal for something that came to be known as Plan B, which is the status quo of current approach to soliciting projects of any scale and any theme and any location, done as we've done, take most of the extra energy that we have going forward to building this organizational structure and a succession plan and a method of making sure that we'll be around for 2 to 5 to 10 more years. And then with 10% of that extra, try and figure out what the next most global thing we could do is. And my colleague, Brent, and others put together this notion of maybe one more assessment added to the current existing structure that would somehow try and say, all right, you may not be able to do a global impact, but could you do a much larger size impact than you ordinarily would have done? Maybe it's not even at the national level, unless you're in Slovenia, in which case it probably could be. That would show that we could experiment with this idea of nested levels of impact, even though they were only measuring direct inside. Now let's also try and measure direct, but in a much larger area, which is probably a whole different set of models and data sets. And just getting them linked up and organizing is the sort of thing that's going to take a lot of work, and we could probably use some help from Esri and other kinds of organizations helping put this thing together. And we heard a couple of dissenting views along the way that maybe that wasn't really good enough to move us towards embracing globalism, but that we couldn't figure out what the next feasible thing to embrace globalism would be. And we knew that without an org chart and a succession plan, that was a moot point anyway, so let's make sure we get that nailed. The idea that there is some urgency around this org chart and succession plan, just as there's urgency in solving the planetary health problem, but it's actually on a shorter scale of years as far as we can tell. And that we need that solution in the next 2 to 5. And if it takes us 5 to 15 to get the planetary solution in place, that would still be acceptable. And there's no way we'd ever achieve the second without having first achieved the first. And I think that pretty much summarizes.
Good. Sounds like everyone in the room is going to be part of this administration. That's good. Great. Thank you.
Okay. So my group had a shorter meeting, I think, than everybody else. So kudos to my team for getting
talked fast.
straight to the action. we had a rambling discussion that I'm now going to spin as a story. So somewhere in the middle of our conversation, somebody asked the question, what was our mission? And you could translate that to be, well, why are we all here? And maybe not everybody was, but so far the value proposition might be that we're a bunch of professors trying to improve pedagogy. Right, so that's sort of perhaps the status quo of as to why some people here at least show up. We then switched to the first question, which was, do we pick the status quo or move in a global direction? We had a diversity of opinions there. For global expansion, in other words, filling the holes, it was an enthusiastic yes. For keeping the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, it was an enthusiastic yes. And then we sort of had if we had 12 people speaking, there were 12 opinions. And none seemed to rise to the top, or otherwise, in the same sense, none sunk to the bottom. We then changed our focus to think about collaboration, since that's part of our title. And there was a long discussion about, well, we could take participating universities and organise them into groups. Perhaps they could benefit from shared assumptions, shared methods, and then look more thoughtfully at collaboration on common ground. We also had a conversation around that about the roadblocks in the United States. For example, we have semester schools and quarter schools, and so their timetables are offset by 4 to 6 weeks at a time. We then compare northern, southern hemisphere, summers, different times, of course, in different places. So there's a lot of logistical challenges there. So that was sort of the second part. Then we had another discussion at one point, I think, about scale, and I think I probably led this part of the discussion. I actually think scale is perhaps a silly way for thinking about different projects and organising them on a continuum of scale or size or whatever you want to call it. Because if we're really interested in sustainability as the goal here, I think the focus has to be on systems. Because if we go back to the beginning of yesterday morning when the first talk was given about moving sand around the globe in order to fuel modernisation, I was just flabbergasted that we were taking Germany and Norway at different times in recent memory were net exporters of sand, and that the recipient was China and perhaps other parts of Asia. To me, sand is a commodity found everywhere, and if we're thinking of China as the recipient, they themselves are home to many fine deserts, which for the most part are probably sand as well. And so this system idea is, in my head, critical to actually making forward progress. If you want to improve water supply in Central Asia, then you've got to change the way in which cotton is grown, harvested, shipped to Bangladesh and other parts of the world, dyed, and then used to fuel garment sales in huge retail establishments across the first world, where most of us, one could say, have way too many clothes. And as a consequence, our carbon footprints are way larger than they need to be. That's just my little aside there. Then we went to the organisation chart and to the governance issue. First, sort of going back to the collaborative piece, sort of within governance and sort of merged then with collaboration. There was a reference to the research collaboration networks that the National Science Foundation fund. They're principally for undergraduates, as I understand them. They're principally about sharing of research and building networks of researchers that share pedagogy, share kind of ways of doing things, of knowing things. In our case, it would likely be funded through something like the Human Environment Dynamics Group, which is sort of the new name for the Geography and Spatial Science program at NSF. Different parts of such a network could be organised to look at Carl's 6 building blocks in terms of his methodology, or maybe it would look at different kinds of systems for the built or the natural environment, or it could be used to look at projects that have a small extent, medium, a large extent. So that was one way, sort of an intermediate way to build out some more deliberate decision making and planning and collaboration. And then towards the end, we got to the organisation chart, and there we started with the question, well, who makes decisions? And not necessarily whether or not they were good or bad decisions, but I think we immediately noted that there was it was unfemale and it was unyoung, meaning there weren't many young people involved in the organisation and leadership of the organisation, and to the best of my knowledge there's few of any females. And so if we wanted to extend and reach and engage more people, I think whoever the leadership is, they need to be reflective of the audience that we are trying to engage and serve, and how to make a transition from the status quo to something new. We discussed a variety of models without coming to any conclusions about whether one model was best, or and we didn't come with the same sort of precision that Stephen and his group did in terms of timelines for doing this, but we thought that should be at the front end rather than the medium or long end of how we choose to evolve going forward. So with that, I'll stop.
So, John, can I follow up on that last point? So, I mean, one of the things we've talked about is, what some of those models were that you've talked about, because we've talked about, should this be a separate 501c3? Should this be more like the way a research journal is run, and it's a consortium of universities that are sharing the administration? Should it be the NSF model? What were some of the other models that came out of your
the only one,
or and others as well?
The only one that we discussed in detail was somebody asked me what I knew about the origins of the University Consortium for Geographic Information Science, and as best I could I explained how that came to be, and since I've been involved with the organisation for its entire existence, what some of the strengths and weaknesses are. To the best of my knowledge, there's no one model here that's best,
right?
And frankly, there's maybe not one model that has legs that would see it last perhaps more than 5 or 10 years, just because of how people's expectations and needs change.
Right. Yeah. Good. And of course, I think one of the advantages, because we're a global group, are there models elsewhere in the world that are common that we also might learn from, which I think is something else we should continue to talk about. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Well, let's see. We can also just bring in others. Were there other thoughts that people have? We have another mic here. I also think that, our hope is not only expanding this as in terms of the number of universities involved, but also how we can talk about what are the advantages of universities wanting to join us. I think that's another a question that we have, as well as we have a number of universities who are part of the IGC but are not doing projects. So how could we also engage more of the 100-some universities that are part of this organization? And are there other ways that they could be involved, even if they're not doing projects? So I think that those are other questions that sort of link the two discussions we had today. Any thoughts about that?
I know that in the discussion group that I was in the morning, this idea that the approaches of geodesign reasonably well understood and could probably fit, we know they fit well with the design studio mechanism. Mm-hmm. We've heard at least anecdotal reports from a number of people who've made it work in a seminar setting. It seems likely that it's good for various kinds of local public participation projects of one sort and another. But there's also room, again, in the School of Government or the School of Business to think of this in a more theoretical terms and sort of in a kind of theories and methods and frameworks environment, or put in the context of other kinds of models of collective generation of information. So there's a lot of connections that could be made if we could develop and contribute some of the specific language of geodesign into some of the other disciplines, right, which would help to build this cadre so that when you came to build a project, there might be some graduate students from, I'm going to say, business and government, or religion and journalism, or biology and physics, who could engage and thereby undoubtedly, interestingly complicate and possibly even strengthen the kinds of results and outcomes. And that would help to engage the rest of the university into this thing rather than the kind of specialized niche which it seems to occupy at present.
Right, yeah, interesting. Brent, you said you had something? Here, that also makes me wonder whether, in fact, there might be paper presentations as some part of this organization, for example, right? Brent?
I think to the notion that was made earlier about having discussion at posters to talk about what we did and that sort of thing would be exceedingly helpful. But even then, in workshops, whether it was these questions or I would like just to see how other classes did their assessments, for instance. I mean, the challenge is it still feels like we just did our thing, and I'm sure there are many other ways to do it, and I don't know all of those other ways, and I'd like to see those other ways to see what we could have adopted from that, whether that's building process models or building impact model, I mean, whatever it might be, just something where we actually sitting down as a collaborative saying, okay, here was our data, or here was some situation, we're just gonna bring some trace paper today and let's do this. Here's how we actually conducted this exercise. To me, that's one way in which you create a collaboration is you actually work on those projects together. Then we get to take that and go back. Because otherwise, all I have is a few minutes of a discussion of this end product and not much in the mechanisms of how we actually accomplish that product.
Right.
And I think that can make it very inaccessible to a lot of people outside.
Yeah,
Do you have a mic?
Well, I think
can
we
bring
have
this
a
for you
mic
now.
coming down.
Oh, you got- okay.
Yeah, and Brent, that really builds on your process question, which is, how did we do it, not just what did we do?
Right.
Right.
This,
Carl.
this very question was at the center of a discussion. Let me start this differently. There have been 2 South American geodesign conferences. The first one was 2 years ago. Brian was there, I was there, and it was very similar to the Geo-Design Summit. People presented papers. In the second one, which was a couple of months ago, again, Brian was there, again, I was there. This time we ran a 2-day workshop, and the people, as faculty and graduate students, were in a workshop that I ran on a tribe in the middle of the state of Santa Catarina who had built a dam and that destroyed their agricultural capability. And the chiefs and the government gave us that problem as the basis of a 2-day workshop with the chiefs taking over at the end, making the decisions. And it was a great experience. So a plan was developed to do another 3rd conference in December. And this time it's going to be a week long, and it's going to basically be a version of a theories and methods course based on the 6 questions, followed by a workshop of 2 days, and it's aimed at faculty. All right? So in a sense, it's an overt teaching mechanism over a 1-week period for faculty. Now, it's not teaching one way, but it's discussing what you've done, because each of them, of the people who are leading it, have done projects in different ways. And so the question is, what do you need to get done? Several different ways of doing it, but then you have to decide how you're going to do it, and you have to do it in a workshop. And Ana Clara and Chico, who are organizing this, with a little bit of advice from me, but not a lot, think that that's a 1-week exercise, a 1-week full-time exercise. And that's absolutely feasible to do. Let me say one more thing while I have the mic. You raised a question that, after about 10 years of working in a framework like this, I knew roughly during a semester what was going to be done by my students. And in other words, I could say in the 4th week, that's what's going to be happening. Now, I didn't know if it was Wednesday or Friday, but I knew it was in the 4th week. So I could say to somebody who I wanted to come into my class, I need an hour of your time. It'll either be Thursday or Tuesday, but it'll be in that week. Can I have it? And I always had yes. And the advantage of a framework is if you have some experience and you'd say, okay, it takes a week to do this, it takes a week to do this, it takes a week to do this, it takes a week. Not only that, but you can organize your students to lead that problem. So I would say the framework, it gives you a huge, you need the experience. It's not an abstraction because different students at different levels may operate differently. But you can actually say there are going to be due dates, and the due dates are not simply what's on your drawing, but it's due dates and where you are in a process. And that's hugely helpful. And frankly, you impose it then on your students.
Well,
I think,
go ahead.
I think also helpful because then in that case we could, get in touch with any other organization, say, hey, let's meet this week. We're going to show your stuff, let's show ours. But I think what would be helpful to that is let's connect those people in those projects and places that are working on it so we can do that. Yeah.
Also, this point you're making, Brent, I mean, for example, you could envision that we had, instead of having the lightning talks, we have poster sessions for the posters, and that the discussions that we have are actually faculty or members of the IGC talking about how they would go about, for example, doing an evaluation process, or how would you, let's take a problem, how would you set this up? And so that we actually start to talk about our different methods and processes.
Well, I could start with representational models and have a few other students where they're working on it and say, okay, we'll facilitate questions.
Yeah.
You've got the next one, you've got, so something like that in a quick blitz way to give people some other context at the post place would be helpful. Then you get to see, oh, that's why their outcome was this, or that's why they accomplished
and we learn
that,
from each other that way, right?
I mean, I think the other thing, this notion of, it may not just be connecting with the collaboration of other universities, but other institutions that might be working on geodesign projects that would be interested in seeing what faculty are teaching their students, and for us to say to the students, here's what industry is actually working on, and let's facilitate this collaboration between the two. That's, I think, one way to sustain life in this sort of piece. It's another notion.
Todd?
Yeah, I know that we're here to help foster and further this, and part of the discussion that we got into is that the students should be more involved in even this kind of conversation when we convene in this room, and that because we were hearing things like, I would choose to learn geodesign and participate in ICG or IGC, but I wouldn't necessarily adopt it as kind of the only thing that I've got in my portfolio, or suggest that the firm that I go to embrace this wholly. And, I think we all recognize what the limitations on that are. So it's a really valuable thing, and we need to let the people who are using it annually help determine how to shape it in the way that we're kind of right now, wisely guessing what that should be. But I think, I'd love to just hand this mic over to a whole bunch of people here, have them say directly, if they could, how to make what Brent was just speculating on better. And I think that sense of involvement will be empowering and in and of itself expand the program, because I think that is a tenet of this whole thing. Engagement of the actual people who are going to use it, benefit, and proliferate it. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think part of this planning for the future needs to create a stronger position for them, and as already been said, create a stronger positions for people in other parts of the world as part of this board. And one last idea is that we thought, actually, this is a dangerous suggestion, but there could be, in order to advance it globally, a competition as well as a collaboration. So there might be a competition that actually gets people to work on the same thing, the polar ice caps or something kind of audacious, and that could be used to celebrate sort of the new advances while the collaboration is operating on a year-to-year basis.
Well, and the other idea behind that, Todd, maybe that is the way we handle this global project. We're all doing our individual local projects, and that'll probably continue, but could there be a big global project that we're all involved in?
We discussed also the example of Jane McGonigal and the World Without Oil global game that was collaborative, not competitive, but yet it had that participation in a game and a challenge. You're competing with time and climate change, not with each other. So that was one idea.
I think gamification is
Yeah,
one strategy.
gamification and the collaborative gaming. And one question I have too is, are there enough scientists in the room to meet our goals? And are there enough science connections in the studio? And is the academic collaborative too weighted in design studio and not enough in research, or designers in residence in research projects to do these global connections? And what would that offer? I'm new, so I can ask these naive questions.
Well, that might be an interesting question. Who in the projects you worked on had social scientists or scientists involved at some level? And who is it? Yeah, right. So a few, right? So, and what was that experience? Were they engaged? Was it a positive? Yeah, why don't you get a mic?
You know, I find it really interesting. In this, I mean, it worked great, and I have a lot of connections through the URI extension, and so we worked really closely with physical oceans, with ocean scientists and modelers, and we really had a very science-heavy. Our project is extremely science-heavy, even though it's sort of visually configured. But I think the thing that's interesting for me is, in terms of this conception is, do you conceive of what we do as being the experts who then are collaborating with these groups, or do we imagine bringing those groups into this organization? I think that's a different decision because, for instance, in Rhode Island, we have a lot of work around ocean spatial planning, right, that really addresses a lot of the things that Carl is talking about achieving, right? The reason the first offshore wind farm in the United States is in Rhode Island is not accidental. It's because there was literally a 10-year effort at engaging stakeholders around the issues of the coastal zone offshore in Rhode Island, and a very intensive, diverse process that involved everything from the tracking of migratory birds down to the perceptions of fishermen, visual aesthetic studies. Really incredible depths. And so the thing is I think for me, I get nervous about, are we trying to duplicate efforts that are there, or should we be the experts who go and engage in that efforts? Because I think the real value, at least from my standpoint, the real value that I see in this process is that we, if science could answer the question on its own, it would be done now, right? Because we have tons of science, right? It's this point of intentionality and design and being able to use the word that we all use, the abductive processes, to move the ball forward. And so I guess what I'm sort of just conceptually wondering is, are we trying to bring all that in and duplicate that effort, or are we the sort of the experts in this sort of abductive processing, right, that go and then engage in these efforts? And one is very labor intensive for IGC, and again, I'm sort of new here, so I'm sorry if I'm speaking out of turn. No. Right, one is very labor intensive for IGC. The other maximizes, or do we focus on our maximal benefit, the real, I guess I was saying, what is our real value proposition? I think the real value proposition is this is the only organization that I've been engaged in terms of dealing with these problems where we're saying, no, we actually need design at the scale of the globe. We need the scale, design at this scale. Right. And I think that's the key value proposition as a social scientist I see here.
Right. Yeah, and following on that, Peter, is that we've been talking about the fact that actually a lot of the sustainable development goals are aspatial. And one of the things we can bring are spatial ways of understanding and how we might achieve those goals. John?
I would say that all of us just need to think super hard about what our own value proposition is, because a lot of the discussion here is perhaps about how we would all, as educators, become better educators. And my motivation from the get-go has been that I'm interested in the kinds of students that I can help develop at the University of Southern California. That's all I care about. Last year, Jennifer Swift and I killed ourselves trying to stand up a studio and finish a studio and the 2 posters ahead of the IGC meeting a year ago. And I left that totally impressed with Professor Swift and her tenacity, and disappointed in our collective performance that we couldn't carry a project all the way through into engaging the stakeholders. Because in terms of building that student outcome, I saw that being able to have students out in the real world, talking to real people, is really a key part of our value proposition. So this year, I've designed a whole different process, which carries a project for 12 months. And now the value proposition for bringing a group of students here is simply to engage all of you and to see that there's a lot of people in the world that know a lot more than I do about all of this stuff and different perspectives. Right? So it's super important to get those things sorted. And I've never, in 40 years, seen a case where an academic made a decision about anything that mattered in the world. And so I think, we can inform decisions, sometimes without even meaning to, and sometimes when we're really hell-bent on changing the world, people are not even going to listen to us. And so I think it's super important to get sorted what we're in it for and what we need to do in the short, medium and long term to support that, which then has a big impact on all the questions about governance and 2, 5, 10 years away and so forth.
Yeah. And following on that, so Joné, your org chart puts students at the top. Could you just talk about what that org chart would be? I'm intrigued.
The idea of this is, in a way, it's related to the mission of a teacher, right? Is how do you send off and provide experiences for students that enable them to be the next leaders or the next conductors if they're specializing in this area. So what that looked like without everything solved was we actually had 2 diagrams side by side. We had our perception of what I've heard called the triumvirate, right? Except Esri was sort of above that, speculative kind of idea of how things work, but that this sort of organizational decision making, and then next to it, this idea of students at the top, teachers alongside them as kind of partners in education, and community of practice within, but then also representation in the decision-making process. So for example, when a new IGC format comes out, would it come out as a draft for a body to have input in? From the user experience, expertise of the teachers and the students. And then, but not just between students and the leadership, but also student to student, peer to peer, I mentioned that. One of the students talked about just, even if they don't go into this, wanting to tinker with things, and tinkering made me think of makerspace and the kind of, how do you and we also talked about GitHub and open source too, and how do you get people excited about geo-design related things if that activity that isn't necessarily perfectly aligned with IGC grows, I think IGC grows too. So, and then we had a org chart vaguely of how IGC would relate to other international bodies.
Great. I love the idea of a Geo-Design makerspace. So we are out of time, and thank you all, and thanks everybody for the work you did today. We sort of start up again at 5 with the Geo-Design Summit, so don't go, but you can leave the room and come back. Mike, were you going to give, or Brian, any kind of marching orders about tonight? In the meantime, let's thank our panelists here.